Jackson Harrington stared at the email notification on his phone, his coffee forgotten as the words blurred before his eyes. Andrea Reynolds seeks urgent meeting regarding personal matter. 9 months since their divorce was finalized, and his ex-wife's name still caused his heart to stutter in his chest. The sleek corner office of Harrington Enterprises' New York headquarters suddenly felt airless, despite the floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the Manhattan skyline. He hadn't heard from Andrea since that final day in court, when they'd both signed the papers with trembling hands, ending 5 years of marriage that had crumbled under the weight of his 80-hour work weeks, and her growing resentment of always coming second to the company. The divorce had been surprisingly civil, painful but not vindictive, with Andrea refusing any settlement beyond what she'd brought into the marriage. "Mr. Harrington." His assistant Diane appeared at the doorway. "Your 10 o'clock is waiting." "Cancel it," Jackson said, already reaching for his jacket. "Cancel everything today. Tell them it's a family emergency." Family. The word felt hollow now. At 42, Jackson had built an empire worth billions, but had lost the only person who mattered. Andrea had wanted children. He had wanted to wait until the company was stable. Now the company was thriving, and he was alone in a penthouse too large for one person. 30 minutes later, Jackson sat in a quiet corner of the Gramercy Park Hotel's tea lounge, a location they'd once loved for Sunday brunches. He spotted her the moment she walked in. Her auburn hair was shorter now, falling just below her shoulders, but she still moved with that quiet grace that had captivated him 6 years ago at a charity gala. What he wasn't prepared for was the infant carrier she carefully maneuvered through the tables. A child. Andrea had a child. The revelation hit Jackson like a physical blow. His fingers tightened around his water glass as calculations raced through his mind. 9 months since the divorce. How long before that had they separated? Almost a year. The timing was, "Hello, Jackson." Andrea's voice was soft but strained as she placed the carrier on the chair beside her. Inside, wrapped in a pale blue blanket, slept a tiny baby with a shock of dark hair that looked uncomfortably familiar. "Andrea." His voice sounded distant to his own ears. "I see congratulations are in order." She didn't smile. "This is Matthew. He's 4 months old." 4 months. The math didn't add up, unless... "He's yours, Jackson. He's our son." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "That's impossible. We were careful. Always." His words came out harsher than intended, but shock had stripped away his usual composure. 99% effective isn't 100%. Andrea's green eyes, once filled with love for him, now held a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. Dark circles beneath them suggested sleepless nights. "I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized." "And you didn't think to tell me?" Anger flared, hot and bright. "I had a right to know. I tried calling you 3 times. Your assistant said you were in Tokyo, then Dubai, then Singapore. I left messages. You never called back." Jackson flinched, remembering the international expansion he'd thrown himself into after the divorce, anything to avoid the empty spaces Andrea had left behind. "I'm telling you now because Matthew needs you," her voice cracked. "He has a congenital heart defect. He needs surgery, expensive, specialized surgery. My insurance won't cover the experimental procedure his doctor recommends, and I've exhausted my savings on his care already." The anger drained from Jackson as quickly as it had come, replaced by a cold fear he'd never experienced in all his years of high-stakes business deals. "How serious is it? Without the surgery?" "He has maybe a year." Andrea's composure finally broke, tears welling in her eyes. "I wouldn't have come to you, but this is beyond pride now. This is Matthew's life." Jackson looked at the sleeping infant, his son. The child had his dark hair, his jawline. Even in sleep, the baby's expressions mirrored his own. Something primal and protective surged within him. "I'll cover everything," he said immediately. "Whatever he needs, wherever in the world we need to go. The best surgeons, the best care." Relief washed over Andrea's face, followed quickly by wariness. "Thank you. I just need the financial help. I don't expect anything else from you." Those words stung more than Jackson expected. "He's my son, Andrea. I have a right to be part of his life." "Do you?" She raised an eyebrow. "You barely had time for a wife. How will you make time for a child?" Before Jackson could respond, Matthew stirred and began to fuss. Andrea lifted him from the carrier with practiced ease, cradling him against her shoulder. The tenderness in her expression as she soothed their son made Jackson's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. "I'd like to schedule the surgery as soon as possible," Andrea said, her attention divided between the conversation and the baby. "Dr. Callahan at Boston Children's Hospital has agreed to take the case, but there's a waiting list unless we can arrange a private procedure. I'll make some calls today. We'll bypass any waiting lists." Jackson reached for his phone, then hesitated. Could I hold him?" Surprise flickered across Andrea's face, but she nodded and carefully transferred the baby into his awkward arms. Matthew weighed almost nothing, a fragile bundle with a rapidly beating heart, a heart that needed saving. The baby's eyes fluttered open, revealing eyes exactly like Jackson's own deep blue ones. The tiny hand that escaped the blanket wrapped reflexively around Jackson's finger with surprising strength. In that moment, looking into the face of his son, Jackson Harrington, the man whose ruthless business instincts had built a technology empire, felt his priorities shift with tectonic force. "I've missed so much already," he said quietly. "I don't want to miss any more." "Jackson," Andrea sighed, "a baby isn't a business acquisition you can just decide to take on. Parenthood requires presence, consistency." "I know what it requires," he interrupted, his eyes still locked on Matthew's. "And I know what I've been missing by prioritizing everything else. Give me a chance, Andrea. Give us a chance." "Us?" Her voice sharpened. "There is no us anymore. You made your choice a long time ago. People change." He finally looked up at her. "Circumstances change. A crisis doesn't fix fundamental problems," Andrea said, taking Matthew back into her arms. "Right now, Matthew needs that surgery. That's all I can focus on." Jackson nodded, respecting her boundary even as determination settled in his bones. "I'll have my lawyers draft the financial arrangements today. No strings attached." He paused, reaching into his wallet for a business card. "But this is my private number. Day or night, if either of you need anything at all, call me directly." As Andrea gathered her things to leave, balancing Matthew expertly on her hip, Jackson made a silent vow to the son he'd just discovered and the woman he'd never stopped loving. Whatever it took, whatever sacrifices he needed to make, he would prove that some things mattered more than empires of glass and steel. Some things were worth rebuilding a life for. What he didn't know was that securing the surgery would be just the beginning of their challenges, and that the past 9 months held secrets Andrea wasn't yet ready to reveal. 3 days after their meeting, Jackson paced the waiting area of Boston Children's Hospital, while Andrea completed Matthew's pre-surgery paperwork. True to his word, Jackson had arranged everything with remarkable efficiency: private transportation to Boston, accommodations at a nearby luxury apartment, and most importantly, an expedited surgery date with Dr. Callahan, the country's leading pediatric cardiac specialist. "Mr. Harrington," a nurse appeared at the doorway, "you can join Ms. Reynolds and Dr. Callahan now." Jackson followed her through a maze of corridors, his mind racing. He'd spent the past 72 hours in a crash course on congenital heart defects, specifically the ventricular septal defect with pulmonary hypertension that threatened his son's life. The medical terminology still felt foreign on his tongue, but he understood enough to know the stakes were life-altering. In the consultation room, Dr. Callahan, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked dark hair and steady hands, was showing Andrea a 3D model of a heart. "The procedure involves patching the hole between the ventricles," she explained, as Jackson slipped into the chair beside Andrea. In Matthew's case, the traditional approach carries significant risks due to the size and location of the defect. "That's why I'm recommending the newer procedure." Andrea nodded, her face pale but composed. Jackson noticed she'd lost weight since their divorce. Her collarbones were more prominent beneath her simple blouse. The strain of caring for a critically ill infant alone had clearly taken its toll. "When can we schedule?" Jackson asked. Dr. Callahan turned her attention to him. "I've cleared my schedule for next Wednesday. We'll need Matthew admitted Tuesday evening for pre-op procedures." "And the success rate?" Jackson pressed. "With traditional surgery for this condition, about 85%, Dr. Callahan said candidly. "With this modified approach, early results show closer to 96% success. But I want to be clear, this is still considered experimental. That's why insurance companies aren't covering it yet." The cost doesn't matter, Jackson stated firmly. Only his survival does. Andrea shot him a look that mingled gratitude with something else, perhaps resentment at the ease with which he could dismiss financial concerns that had kept her awake night after night. After finalizing details with Dr. Callahan, they walked together to the hospital parking garage in uncomfortable silence. Jackson had arranged for a driver, but Andrea had insisted on keeping her own car for independence. "I've taken a leave of absence from work," Jackson said as they reached Andrea's modest sedan. "I'll be staying at the apartment too, in the second bedroom. I want to be here through all of this." Andrea paused, her key fob halfway to the lock. "You've what?" "I've cleared my calendar for the next month. Diane is forwarding only absolute emergencies, and Thomas is handling day-to-day operations." "That's unexpected." Andrea's surprise was evident. During their marriage, Jackson had never taken more than 3 consecutive days away from work. "He's my son, Andrea," Jackson's voice softened, "and you shouldn't have to do this alone." For a moment, vulnerability flickered across her face before she tucked it away. "Just don't make promises you can't keep, Jackson. Matthew doesn't need disappointment on top of everything else." "I won't disappoint him," Jackson said with quiet intensity. "Or you." The week before surgery passed in a strange domestic rhythm. The 2-bedroom apartment Jackson had secured was spacious and comfortable, with a nursery hastily but expertly outfitted by an interior designer Jackson had called. Andrea had rolled her eyes at the hand-painted murals and custom furniture, but couldn't deny that the hospital-grade monitoring equipment integrated into the nursery design brought her peace of mind. They established an awkward co-parenting routine, with Andrea showing Jackson the basics of baby care: how to prepare bottles, the proper way to support Matthew's head, the subtle differences between his hungry cry and his tired cry. Jackson proved a surprisingly apt pupil, his businessman's attention to detail serving him well, as he mastered the art of diaper changing with determined focus. On the 3rd night, as a thunderstorm rattled the windows, Jackson found Andrea in the kitchen at 3 a.m., warming a bottle while Matthew fussed in a baby carrier on the counter. "You should have woken me," he said, stifling a yawn. "We agreed to split the night shifts." "Force of habit," Andrea replied, testing the milk temperature on her wrist. "I've been doing this solo for 4 months. Jackson took the bottle from her. "Go back to bed. I've got this feeding." Andrea hesitated, maternal instinct warring with bone-deep exhaustion. "Are you sure?" "Positive." Jackson lifted Matthew carefully from the carrier. "We'll be fine." When Andrea disappeared down the hallway, Jackson settled into an armchair with his son cradled in the crook of his arm. As Matthew hungrily accepted the bottle, Jackson found himself studying the tiny features illuminated by the soft lamp glow. "You know," he whispered, "I've negotiated billion-dollar deals less intimidating than figuring out how to be your dad." Matthew's tiny hand wrapped around his finger in response, and Jackson felt that same fierce protectiveness surge through him. The next morning, Jackson awoke to raised voices from the living room. Throwing on a t-shirt, he emerged to find Andrea facing off with a tall, athletic man whose back was to Jackson. "This is completely inappropriate, Ryan," Andrea was saying, arms crossed defensively. "You can't just show up here." "I've been worried sick about you both," the man, Ryan, replied. "You disappeared from Philadelphia without a word, and then I find out through Megan that Matthew's having surgery. How could you not tell me?" "It all happened very quickly," Andrea explained, her voice strained. "And it's complicated." "What's complicated about letting me know?" Ryan's voice rose. "After everything we've been through together, after how I've been there for both of you." "Is there a problem here?" Jackson interrupted, making his presence known. Ryan turned, revealing a handsome face with a day's worth of stubble and confused green eyes. He was younger than Jackson by several years, dressed in medical scrubs beneath a leather jacket. "Jackson," Andrea said, tension radiating from her. "This is Ryan Chambers. He's Matthew's pediatrician from Philadelphia." "Ryan, this is Jackson Harrington." "Harrington?" Ryan's eyes widened with recognition. "The ex-husband?" His gaze darted between them, piecing things together. "Wait, is he the reason you suddenly had access to Dr. Callahan? Is he paying for the surgery?" "Matthew is my son," Jackson stated simply. Ryan's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "Your son? But you told me." He broke off, turning back to Andrea. You said Matthew's father wasn't in the picture, that he didn't even know. I recently informed Jackson about Matthew, Andrea said carefully. Given the urgency of the surgery, it seemed necessary. Necessary, Ryan repeated flatly. So the past 4 months, everything between us was what exactly? Just you biding time until a better financial option came along? Jackson watched Andrea flinch at the accusation. Ryan, that's unfair. You know it wasn't like that. Do I? Ryan ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been keeping secrets from everyone. Does he even know about us? Jackson's eyes snapped to Andrea's face, which had gone pale. There's something you're not telling me, he said quietly. Andrea looked trapped between the two men. After a long moment, she sighed. Ryan and I have been seeing each other for the past 3 months. He's been supportive, with Matthew, with everything. The revelation shouldn't have hurt as much as it did. Jackson had no claim on Andrea's personal life, not anymore. But something about the obvious familiarity between her and this doctor, the way Ryan clearly felt entitled to be part of Matthew's life, struck a nerve Jackson hadn't known was exposed. I see, he said, his businessman's mask sliding into place. Well, Dr. Chambers, I appreciate your concern for my son and his mother, but as you can see, they're both being well cared for. Your son, Ryan repeated, something dangerous flashing in his eyes. Convenient timing, showing up just when they need your money. Where were you during the first trimester sickness? The midnight feedings? The first smiles? Ryan, stop, Andrea interjected. This isn't helping. No, Andrea, I think it's a fair question, Jackson replied coolly. Where was I? I was exactly where Andrea left me, trying to rebuild my life after our marriage ended. Had I known about Matthew, things would have been different. The tension in the room thickened, charged with unspoken accusations and complicated history. Matthew, sensing the atmosphere, began to cry from his bassinet in the corner. All 3 adults instinctively moved toward him, creating an absurd tableau that might have been comical under different circumstances. Andrea reached him first, lifting him protectively. This is exactly what I was afraid of, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Matthew needs stability right now, not drama. His surgery is in 3 days. Ryan's expression softened at the mention of the surgery. That's why I came. I wanted to be here for it, for both of you. I appreciate that, Andrea said gently, but we need to focus solely on Matthew right now. Everything else has to wait. As Ryan reluctantly took his leave with a promise to call later, Jackson watched the careful way Andrea avoided his gaze. There were clearly complications beyond Matthew's heart that needed addressing, but Andrea was right. The surgery came first. What troubled him most, however, wasn't Ryan's presence in their lives. It was the growing suspicion that Andrea had deliberately kept him in the dark about their son, and he couldn't help wondering what else she might be hiding. The morning of Matthew's surgery arrived with a heavy September rain that drummed against the hospital windows. Jackson and Andrea sat side by side in the pre-op room, watching as nurses prepared their son for the procedure. The tension between them had grown more complicated since Ryan's unexpected appearance, with conversations limited to Matthew's care and surgical preparations. Mr. and Mrs. Harrington, a nurse appeared with clipboard in hand. Ms. Reynolds, Andrea corrected automatically. We're not married. The nurse's smile faltered momentarily. I apologize. We need final signatures from both parents. As they signed the necessary forms, Jackson noticed Andrea's hand trembling slightly. Without thinking, he covered it with his own. He's going to be fine, he said quietly. Callahan is the best. Andrea didn't pull away as he expected. Instead, she turned her palm up and squeezed his hand briefly before letting go. I know. Her voice faltered. I can't imagine my life without him. A team of surgical nurses arrived to take Matthew to the operating room. The senior nurse, a kind-faced woman named Patricia, assured them, Dr. Callahan will send updates every hour. The family waiting room has private alcoves if you need space. Watching their tiny son being wheeled away, Jackson felt an unfamiliar pressure behind his eyes. Andrea made a small, choked sound beside him, and he instinctively put an arm around her shoulders. To his surprise, she leaned into him briefly, accepting the comfort before straightening and wiping her eyes. Coffee, he offered, desperate for something practical to do during the 8-hour wait ahead. Please. Black. Andrea gathered her coat and bag. I'm going to call my parents. They're driving up from Virginia. In the hospital cafeteria, Jackson was studying the coffee options when a familiar voice called his name. Ryan Chambers stood behind him in scrubs, looking tired but determined. I'm not here to create problems, Ryan said quickly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. I just want to know if the surgery's started. Just now, Jackson replied stiffly. Why are you here, Chambers? And don't tell me it's just professional concern. Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I care about them, both of them. I've been there since Matthew was born. I was there when Andrea first noticed his breathing issues, when the local hospital misdiagnosed it, when she cried herself to sleep, worried about his future. The words landed like individual blows. These were moments Jackson should have shared, would have shared had he known. I understand you feel involved, Jackson said carefully, but I'm his father. Biology isn't everything, Ryan countered. Where were you when I didn't know he existed, Jackson interrupted, anger flaring. That wasn't my choice. Ryan paused, something shifting in his expression. Wait, when exactly did Andrea tell you about Matthew? 4 days ago, Jackson replied. Why? Ryan stared at him in evident disbelief. 4 days? Not 4 months? No. I had no idea until she contacted me last week. Jackson studied Ryan's reaction with growing suspicion. Why does that surprise you? The doctor seemed momentarily speechless. Because Andrea told me months ago that she'd informed you about Matthew and you wanted nothing to do with him, that you'd offered money but refused involvement. The revelation hit Jackson like a physical blow. She told you what? That's why I've been so... Ryan trailed off, looking troubled. She said you knew but chose your company over your son, just like you'd chosen it over your marriage. Jackson set down the coffee cups, his hands suddenly unsteady. That's not what happened. She never told me about him until the surgery became necessary. The two men regarded each other with new understanding, both processing the implications of Andrea's deception. I need to speak with her, Jackson said finally. Not today, Ryan said firmly. Whatever this is about, it can wait until Matthew's through surgery. Despite his anger, Jackson knew Ryan was right. Fine. But this isn't over. When Jackson returned to the waiting room with coffee, he found Andrea sitting alone, staring at her phone. My parents' flight is delayed, she said, accepting the cup without meeting his eyes. Jackson sat beside her, struggling to maintain his composure. The knowledge of her lie burned inside him, but confronting her now would only add stress during an already impossible day. Instead, he pulled out his tablet and focused on answering urgent work emails, channeling his anger into productivity. 3 hours into surgery, Dr. Callahan's assistant delivered their first update. Everything proceeding as expected. Patient's vitals stable. Relief washed through them both, and Andrea instinctively reached for Jackson's hand. He let her take it, his warring emotions no match for their shared concern for Matthew. The 4th hour brought similar news, but by the 5th hour the updates stopped coming. Jackson checked his watch repeatedly, growing more anxious with each passing minute. Andrea paced the small waiting area, chewing her thumbnail, a nervous habit he remembered from their marriage. Something's wrong, she whispered after 30 minutes without word. They promised hourly updates. Surgical timing isn't an exact science, Jackson said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Maybe they're at a critical point that requires full concentration. When Patricia finally appeared in the doorway, her surgical mask pulled down around her neck, both parents froze. There's been a complication, she said gently. Dr. Callahan is managing it, but Matthew's blood pressure dropped unexpectedly. The doctor needs your authorization to perform an additional procedure. Andrea swayed slightly, and Jackson steadied her with a hand on her arm. Whatever he needs, he said firmly. Whatever it takes. As they signed more forms, Jackson noticed Andrea's hands were ice cold. Her face had drained of all color. This is my fault, she whispered once Patricia had left. If I'd brought him in sooner, if I hadn't waited so long to contact you. Don't, Jackson interrupted. This isn't helping Matthew. You don't understand, she insisted, tears welling in her eyes. I let my pride and resentment cloud my judgment. I could lose our son because I was too stubborn to ask for help earlier. The raw emotion in her voice penetrated Jackson's anger. Andrea, listen to me. Matthew is getting the best care possible now. That's what matters. For the first time, Andrea truly looked at him, really seeing him. "How are you so calm? How are you not blaming me right now?" "Because I'm terrified," Jackson admitted quietly. "And because there'll be time for everything else later, if you're still willing to talk honestly." Something flashed across Andrea's face, recognition, perhaps, of the double meaning in his words. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. "It's Ryan," she said, checking the screen. "He wants to know if there's news." Jackson tensed. "You've been updating him?" "He cares about Matthew," Andrea replied defensively. "Because you let him believe I didn't," Jackson said, unable to contain himself any longer. "He told me, Andrea, about the lie you've been telling for months." Andrea's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. "Jackson, I can explain." "Can you? Can you explain why you told him, and who knows who else, that I abandoned my own child, when you never even gave me the chance to be his father?" "It wasn't like that," Andrea insisted, her voice dropping to a whisper. "When I found out I was pregnant, I was angry and hurt. Our divorce was still fresh, and I convinced myself you wouldn't want the responsibility. So, you decided for me," Jackson said flatly. "Just like you decided our marriage was over." Andrea flinched. "That's not fair. You were never there, Jackson. Never present even when you were physically in the room. How was I supposed to believe you'd suddenly change for a baby?" "You should have given me the choice," he said, struggling to keep his voice even. "That wasn't your decision to make." Before Andrea could respond, the waiting room door opened again. This time, Dr. Callahan herself stood there, still in surgical scrubs, her expression carefully composed. Jackson and Andrea rose in unison, instinctively moving closer together as they braced for news. "Matthew's surgery had a significant complication," Dr. Callahan began. "His heart went into arrhythmia during the repair. We had to place him on bypass temporarily, which wasn't part of the original plan." Andrea made a small, wounded sound. Jackson found himself gripping her hand tightly. "However," Dr. Callahan continued, "we were able to stabilize him. The additional procedure was successful, and we completed the primary repair. He's being moved to the ICU now, where he'll remain for at least 48 hours under close monitoring." "He's alive?" Andrea whispered. "He's going to be okay." Dr. Callahan's professional demeanor softened slightly. "His condition is critical, but stable. The next 24 hours are crucial, but yes, I'm cautiously optimistic." Relief crashed through Jackson with such force that his legs nearly buckled. Beside him, Andrea began to cry silently, tears streaming down her face. "When can we see him?" Jackson asked. "In about an hour, once he's settled in ICU. Only for a few minutes initially," Dr. Callahan warned. "He's heavily sedated and connected to numerous monitors." After the doctor left, Jackson and Andrea stood in stunned silence, the argument momentarily forgotten in the wake of their son's survival. Without speaking, Andrea leaned against Jackson's chest, and he wrapped his arms around her as she sobbed with relief. "He made it," she kept whispering. "He made it." For that brief suspended moment, they were united again, not as husband and wife, but as parents facing the most frightening day of their lives. When they were finally allowed into the ICU, the sight of their tiny son, connected to a maze of tubes and monitors, was overwhelming. Matthew looked impossibly small in the hospital crib, his chest covered in bandages, his skin pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Jackson felt something fundamental shift inside him as he looked at his son. Nothing else mattered. Not the company, not the past deceptions, not even his own hurt pride. All that mattered was this child and his recovery. "I'm staying tonight," Jackson said quietly as they prepared to leave the ICU after their brief visit. "You should go back to the apartment, get some rest." Andrea shook her head. "I can't leave him." "Then we both stay," he said simply. "We'll take turns sitting with him." As they settled into the uncomfortable waiting room chairs for the night ahead, Jackson knew that whatever happened between him and Andrea, whatever truths still needed to be confronted, nothing would ever be the same again. The foundations of his world had been irreversibly altered. The revelation about Andrea's lie still simmered beneath the surface, a conversation postponed but not forgotten. But watching her now, exhausted and vulnerable, as she dozed fitfully in the chair across from him, Jackson found himself wondering if there might still be a path forward for all of them, a path he hadn't considered possible just days ago. Matthew's recovery progressed with agonizing slowness. The first 72 hours after surgery were a blur of hourly vital checks, hushed consultations with doctors, and brief, precious moments when Jackson and Andrea were allowed to touch their son's tiny hand or speak softly to him as he drifted in and out of sedation. By the fourth day, Dr. Callahan delivered the news they'd been desperate to hear. The repair is holding beautifully. His heart function has improved significantly, and we're seeing none of the complications we feared. Andrea collapsed into a chair, overcome with relief, while Jackson maintained his composure, just long enough to shake the doctor's hand before turning away to hide the tears that threatened to fall. "We'll move him out of ICU tomorrow if this progress continues," Dr. Callahan added. "After that, we're looking at about 10 more days in the hospital, followed by recovery at home." Home. The word hung between Jackson and Andrea, loaded with unspoken questions. Would it be her Philadelphia apartment, his New York penthouse, the temporary Boston residence they'd reluctantly shared during this crisis? Throughout Matthew's critical days, they'd maintained an unspoken truce, setting aside the revelation of Andrea's deception to focus entirely on their son. They developed an efficient routine, taking alternating shifts at Matthew's bedside, passing in the hallway with brief updates and coffee exchanges. The pattern allowed them to minimize direct confrontation while maximizing Matthew's parental contact. Ryan had maintained a respectful distance, texting Andrea occasionally, but not visiting the hospital again after his conversation with Jackson. Whatever personal feelings were involved, all three adults had silently agreed that Matthew's recovery took precedence over their complicated emotional entanglements. On the day Matthew was transferred to a regular pediatric room, Jackson returned from a quick shower at the apartment to find Andrea sitting beside their son's crib, reading aloud from a children's book. Matthew was awake, his blue eyes, so like Jackson's own, tracking her movements with newfound alertness. "His color's better," Jackson observed, setting down the fresh clothes and toiletries he'd brought for Andrea. She looked up with a genuine smile, the first he'd seen since before the surgery. "The nurse says his oxygen levels are almost normal. He even took a little formula earlier." Jackson approached the crib, where Matthew immediately reached for him with a weak but determined grip. The simple gesture of recognition struck Jackson with unexpected force. Despite everything, his son knew him now. "We need to talk, Andrea," he said quietly, stroking Matthew's dark hair. "About everything. About the future." Andrea's smile faded, but she nodded. "I know. Doctor, Callahan says they're keeping him under observation for a few hours. We could go to the family room." The hospital's family consultation room offered more privacy than the waiting areas, with comfortable seating and a large window overlooking the Boston skyline. Andrea sat across from Jackson, her exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes and the way her clothes hung loosely on her frame. "I owe you an explanation," she began before he could speak, "and an apology." "Yes, you do," Jackson agreed, his tone measured. "But first I need to know one thing. Why? Why lie about telling me about Matthew?" Andrea looked down at her hands, twisted together in her lap. "It started as self-protection. When I discovered I was pregnant, we'd been divorced for just weeks. I was still hurt, still angry about how our marriage had ended." "We both made mistakes in our marriage," Jackson acknowledged. "Yes, we did." Andrea met his eyes briefly before continuing. "I tried calling you those times I mentioned, but when you didn't return my calls, it confirmed everything I believed about your priorities. So I decided to handle it myself." "That doesn't explain telling Ryan I knew and didn't want involvement," Jackson pointed out, struggling to keep accusation from his voice. Andrea sighed deeply. "By the time I met Ryan, Matthew was 2 months old. I was exhausted, scared about his worsening symptoms and struggling financially. Ryan was kind, attentive, everything I'd needed during those final months of our marriage." Jackson flinched but remained silent. "He asked about Matthew's father naturally," she continued. "The truth, that I'd never told you, made me look petty and selfish. So I created a version where I'd done the right thing and you had chosen not to be involved." She looked up, guilt evident in her expression. "It was easier than admitting I was punishing you by keeping your son from you." The raw honesty of her confession diffused some of Jackson's anger. "You should have told me, Andrea. Whatever problems existed between us, Matthew deserved to have both his parents from the beginning." "I know that now," she whispered. "Watching you with him these past days, you're a natural father, Jackson. Better than I ever gave you credit for. I robbed both of you of months together, and I'm truly sorry for that." Jackson leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I'm not the same man I was during our marriage. Losing you." He paused, collecting himself. "It forced me to reevaluate everything. I still work hard, but I've learned there's more to life than quarterly reports and market expansions." "What are you saying?" Andrea asked cautiously. "I'm saying I want to be a father to Matthew, a real, present, involved father, not just financially, but in all the ways that matter." Jackson held her gaze steadily. "I want joint custody." Andrea didn't look surprised by the request. "I expected that. And you deserve it. Matthew deserves it. We can work out the arrangements with lawyers once he's fully recovered." "There's more," Jackson continued, his heart pounding uncomfortably in his chest. "These past 2 weeks, despite everything, have reminded me of what I lost when our marriage ended. Not just you, but the future we'd planned together." Andrea's eyes widened slightly. "Jackson." "I'm not proposing we get back together," he clarified quickly. "Too much has happened. But I am asking if you'd consider moving back to New York to give us a chance to co-parent Matthew more effectively. I could help set you up with a practice there." Andrea had been a well-respected pediatric nutritionist before their marriage, specializing in children with chronic conditions. "And what about Ryan?" Andrea asked softly. Jackson's jaw tightened involuntarily. "That's your personal business, but I need to know, is he the reason you'd say no?" Andrea was quiet for a long moment. "Ryan is a good man who stepped up when I needed support, but—" She hesitated. "Our relationship has always been complicated by Matthew's condition and my unresolved feelings about our marriage. He deserves someone who can offer more than I've been able to." "You haven't answered my question," Jackson pointed out. "No. He's not the reason I'd say no," Andrea admitted. "But moving back to New York is a major decision. I'd need to think about it." "That's fair," Jackson conceded. "Just promise me you'll consider it." Their conversation was interrupted by a nurse appearing at the doorway. "Mr. Harrington? Ms. Reynolds? Matthew's being moved to his regular room now if you'd like to join him." The discussion was temporarily shelved as they focused on getting Matthew settled in his new room, with its cheerful animal paintings and window view of the hospital's garden courtyard. The improvement in their son's condition was remarkable. Within days of leaving the ICU, he was more alert, his natural personality beginning to emerge through the haze of medications and procedures. 1 week after surgery, Dr. Callahan delivered another positive update. "His recovery is exceeding our expectations. If this continues, we can discuss discharge planning by the end of next week." That evening, as Jackson took his turn sitting with Matthew while Andrea went to the apartment to shower and change, his phone chimed with an email from his executive assistant. The quarterly board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday in New York, his first major company obligation since Matthew's surgery. In the past, such a meeting would have been non-negotiable. Now Jackson found himself typing a response without hesitation. "Will attend virtually. Family situation requires my presence in Boston." When Andrea returned, she found Jackson holding a sleeping Matthew against his chest, the baby's tiny head tucked beneath his father's chin. "Your company called while I was at the apartment," she said, setting down her overnight bag. "Diane wanted to confirm you'd be back for the board meeting." "I already told her I'm staying here," Jackson replied without looking up from Matthew's peaceful face. Andrea stared at him. "The quarterly board meeting? You've never missed one." "Some things are more important." Jackson carefully transferred Matthew back to his crib. "I've been thinking about what happens after Matthew's discharged. He'll need specialized follow-up care for months." "I know. Doctor." Callahan recommended a cardiac specialist in Philadelphia who— "What if it wasn't Philadelphia?" Jackson interrupted. "What if you both stayed in New York? I've already contacted Columbia Presbyterian about their pediatric cardiac program. They're among the best in the country, and I've arranged for Matthew's case to be transferred there." Andrea frowned. "You did what? Without consulting me?" "I'm just creating options," Jackson clarified. "The final decision is yours, of course." "But I've also had my real estate agent looking at apartments near mine. 3 bedrooms, ground floor for easier access with the stroller, close to Central Park." "Jackson," Andrea said warily, "this feels like you're trying to control the situation." He recognized his mistake immediately. In typical fashion, he'd rushed ahead with solutions without considering how they'd be perceived. "You're right. I overstepped. I just—" He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. I can't bear the thought of being separated from him again, or seeing him only on designated weekends and holidays. Andrea's expression softened. I understand that, but any decision about moving needs to be made together, with Matthew's best interests at heart. You're right, Jackson acknowledged, but will you at least visit the pediatric cardiology department at Columbia before deciding, and maybe look at a couple of apartments? No pressure, just information gathering. After a moment's hesitation, Andrea nodded. That's reasonable. We can make a day trip once Matthew's discharged. 2 weeks later, Matthew was released from the hospital with a clean bill of health and a detailed recovery plan. The tiny scar on his chest would fade with time, Dr. Callahan assured them, and with proper follow-up care he could look forward to a normal, healthy childhood. They settled into a temporary routine at the Boston apartment, while Matthew continued to recover his strength. Jackson worked remotely most days, scheduling video conferences around Matthew's nap times and doctor appointments. Andrea began researching job opportunities in both Philadelphia and New York, weighing her options carefully. On a crisp October morning, Jackson took Matthew for a walk in the stroller, while Andrea had a phone interview with a children's hospital in Philadelphia. When they returned, Jackson found her sitting on the balcony, staring thoughtfully at the Boston skyline. "How was the interview?" he asked, lifting a drowsy Matthew from the stroller. "Good. They're offering a position heading their nutritional therapy department for cardiac patients." Andrea turned to look at him. "I also had a call from Columbia Presbyterian while you were out. They've created a similar position in their pediatric department." Jackson tried to mask his hopeful expression. "Both sound like excellent opportunities." "They are." Andrea stood, approaching them to brush a gentle hand over Matthew's head. "I've been thinking a lot about what's best for him, and for us." "And?" Jackson prompted when she fell silent. "And I think you should show me those New York apartments you mentioned." Andrea met his gaze directly. "I'm not making any promises, but I'm willing to consider it, for Matthew's sake." Relief washed through Jackson. "I can arrange viewings for next week." The following Tuesday, they flew to New York on Jackson's private jet. Matthew's first flight experienced mostly in contented sleep against his father's chest. Jackson had arranged for a car service with an infant seat, which transported them to the first of 3 apartments his real estate agent had selected. The third property, a sun-filled corner unit in a pre-war building just 2 blocks from Jackson's penthouse, caught Andrea's attention immediately. It featured high ceilings, hardwood floors, and a nursery with bay windows overlooking a tree-lined street. "This one feels right," she admitted as they completed the tour. "I could see us building a life here." Jackson's heart leapt at the word us, though he knew she meant herself and Matthew. "It's perfect for both of you," he agreed, "and close enough that I could be involved daily, not just on weekends." Later, after a tour of Columbia's pediatric facilities and a quiet dinner at a restaurant near Central Park, they sat on a bench watching the sunset paint the city skyline in shades of gold and pink. Matthew slept peacefully in his stroller beside them. "I've decided to take the position at Columbia," Andrea said suddenly. "And the apartment. We'll move to New York next month." Jackson turned to her in surprise. "You're sure?" "Yes." She gazed at their sleeping son. "These past weeks have shown me how important it is for Matthew to have both parents actively involved in his life, and watching you change your priorities so completely," she hesitated. "It's made me reconsider some things I thought were certain." "What things?" Jackson asked cautiously. Andrea met his eyes. "I convinced myself our marriage failed because you were incapable of putting family first, but maybe it was timing, not capacity. Maybe we both needed to grow. I've done a lot of growing since losing you," Jackson admitted quietly. "Some lessons you can only learn the hard way." "Same here." Andrea smiled ruefully. "Like learning that pride can cost you more than just your own happiness." As twilight deepened around them, Jackson tentatively reached for her hand. "I'm not asking for everything back the way it was, but I'd like a chance to see what might be possible now, for all 3 of us." Andrea hesitated only briefly before interlacing her fingers with his. "One step at a time," she said softly. "We owe that much to ourselves and to him." 6 months later, on a bright spring morning, Jackson stood in his kitchen preparing coffee while Matthew played with wooden blocks on the living room floor. At 15 months old, their son had fully recovered from his surgery, developing into a curious, energetic toddler with Jackson's determined nature and Andrea's quick smile. The sound of a key in the lock announced Andrea's arrival. She'd maintained her separate apartment, but the boundaries between their lives had gradually softened. Family dinners had become a regular occurrence, followed increasingly by evenings spent together long after Matthew was asleep. "Morning," she called, setting down grocery bags on the counter. "I brought ingredients for Matthew's favorite pancakes." Jackson leaned over to kiss her cheek, a gesture that had once been cautious and uncertain, but now felt natural. "He's been asking for Mama since he woke up." At the sound of his mother's voice, Matthew looked up from his blocks and broke into a delighted smile. "Mama!" he called, pulling himself up and toddling toward her with outstretched arms. Andrea swept him into a hug, twirling him in a circle that produced peals of laughter. "There's my brave boy. Did you have fun with Daddy?" As Jackson watched them, he marveled at how completely his life had transformed in a single year. The man who had once measured success in acquisitions and profit margins now found his greatest joy in these simple domestic moments. Later, as they walked together through Central Park, Matthew secure between them with each tiny hand held in one of theirs, Andrea turned to Jackson with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking," she said. "Matthew's getting bigger. The guest room at my place that we've been using as his nursery won't be big enough soon." "We could look for a larger apartment," Jackson suggested, though his heart quickened at what he sensed might be coming. "Or," Andrea said carefully, "we could consider a different arrangement, one that might be better for all of us." Jackson stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "What kind of arrangement did you have in mind?" Andrea took a deep breath. "The kind where we stop pretending we're just co-parents, the kind where we acknowledge that what we're rebuilding is a family." "Andrea," Jackson said, his voice thick with emotion, "are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying I love you," she replied simply. "I never really stopped, even when I was angriest. And I'm saying that Matthew deserves to grow up with parents who aren't afraid to try again, to do better this time." Jackson released Matthew's hand to cup Andrea's face gently. "I love you too. I always have. But are you sure? After everything?" "The crisis brought us back together," Andrea acknowledged, "but it's how you've changed, how we've both changed, that makes me believe we could make it work this time." Matthew, impatient with the pause in their walk, tugged at their legs. "Go," he demanded, pointing toward the duck pond ahead. They both laughed, the tension of the moment breaking. "He gets that bossiness from you," Andrea teased. "Definitely," Jackson agreed, taking Matthew's hand again. "And his stubbornness is all you." As they continued their walk, making plans for a future none of them could have imagined a year earlier, Jackson reflected on the strange path that had led them here. A heart defect that had nearly taken their son had ultimately helped heal the broken places between them, creating space for something new and stronger to grow. It wasn't the future he had planned, standing alone in his office that day 9 months after their divorce. It was infinitely better.